Well, well, well. Here again, I see. Alrighty, everyone. It is May 14th, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this is the Mike Wink Show. So let's just jump right into it. So this looks like a longer op-ed piece on the suspension of habeas corpus. So if you've been following along with all of the due process nonsense, there's been serious questions about the Trump administration's respect for the rule of due process in our legal system. They shipped away a number of people to El Salvador without any proper due process or court hearing or ruling that they're supposed to do so, stripping them from their ability to prove their innocence. Um, they argued very cynically and incorrectly that we don't have the capacity to give everybody, all of those people, a proper court date. That is just not true. That's how we've done things since the beginning of this country. So the assertion that we don't have the resources to do that is absolutely ridiculous. Um, and the idea that we would suspend habeas corpus for anybody is antithetical to the concept of the United States. Um, you're supposed to be, just by virtue of being a human being, existing in the United States, whether you're here legally, illegally, whether you're a murderer or an innocent child, you are deserving of your day in court. You're innocent until proven guilty, and that is a core tenet of the American dream. That you aren't going to be oppressed by some tyrannical government who decides unilaterally that you've committed a crime based on evidence without it actually being proven or possibly no evidence at all. And so this is especially scary. There's been a number of people in the Trump administration lately that have been floating the idea of suspending habeas corpus, which is my understanding is the concept of due process. They're wanting to suspend habeas corpus for certain groups of people. They want to essentially create a second class group of not citizens but of human beings, um, those who are undeserving, have not met the qualifications necessary to receive a court hearing or whatever. But anyways, this is a longer op-ed piece. Let's see what it has to say, and let's get right into it. The astonishing threat to suspend habeas corpus. The White House driveway is an unlikely venue for announcing plans to upend the Constitution. But strolling back to the bank of microphones on a sunny spring afternoon, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller seemed delighted to share the news that the Trump administration is actively looking at suspending the writ of habeas corpus, the fundamental constitutional right of those who have been detained to argue in court for their release. So that aligns with my understanding of what habeas corpus is. Basically, it is the broad concept of due process, your right to a day in court, innocence until proven guilty, yada yada yada. This was this was, to all appearances, no casual aside. Rather, the question that prompted Miller's remark had all the earmarks of being planted in advance. Before taking any other queries, Miller pointed to the back of the crowd, where a reporter from Gateway Pundit, far-right website, asserted that Trump had been discussing taking this controversial step to take care of the illegal immigration problem, and asked when could we see that happen, do you think? Miller's reply was delivered with his trademark style, condescension undimmed by any recognition of his own ignorance. The New Yorker hires some good writers. This is really well written. That's such a great little backhanded like diss. That's so good. This I need to read that again. Miller's reply was delivered with his trademark style, condescension undimmed by any recognition of his own ignorance. That is so good. I love it. The Constitution is clear, and that of course is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. He put particular stress on the second syllable of supreme, as if some pesky court might be trying to flex its muscle at constitutional expense. Yeah, I like how this article right from the start is pointing out that the language and that the way that they are attacking this is very calculated and very specific and very purposefully manipulative, and that it takes a skilled reader, somebody who has decent reading comprehension skills, to be able to actually parse out that from, actually for good faith speech. Also, I'm sure, or I have a feeling this article is going to get into this into more detail, but the idea that uh, there's an invasion going on is entirely illegal. And what I mean by that is the word invasion has a meaning. Words have meanings, right? Like words are can change meaning, but words have established meanings. And an invasion requires somebody to be sending people. You cannot argue that a whole group of people on their own volition deciding to illegally cross the border or illegally claim asylum or correctly legally claim asylum, that they're being the idea that that is an invasion is not it's just not correct. It's not that doesn't align up with the definition of invasion. Invasion requires somebody to be sending them. Okay. An invasion is like when a government sends a military to do something. Um, it doesn't even have to be a government when it is a directed, coordinated effort. There's no evidence that, like, to the extent that immigrants have made their way into the U.S. or gangs from other countries have managed to establish here, um, nobody is sending them. It just happens. They're all doing it on their own volition, um, and so that's why this doesn't make any sense. Is it's the word invasion means something, and they're trying to obfuscate the meaning of the word invasion and use it cynically to their own extent. The lecture proceeded with Miller asserting that the Immigration and Nationality Act had decreed that Article 3 courts, federal judges with lifetime tenure, in contrast to immigration judges who are part of the executive branch and can be fired, aren't even allowed to be involved in immigration cases. Many of you probably don't know this. That seems insane to me because no, that is not. Okay, so if immigration judges can be fired by the executive. That means that they aren't really judges in the same capacity that like a legal judge would be. They probably are like they just have the word judge there, but the word judge is being used very differently in that sense. And this is the separation of powers. This is like by definition an issue of a separation of powers, right? Um, the whole point of separation of powers is so that not one branch can get too powerful and do things that are oppressive or steps on the toes of the jurisdiction of the other branches. Or the idea of checks and balances is that each of these branches of government keep themselves in check. And so it's important that judges that are completely separate from the executive branch are able to review decisions and actions made by the executive. If immigration judges who aren't really judges, who are oversought by the executive, are the ones themselves that are in charge of overseeing if the executive is doing things correctly. You see where the problem is there, right? They can't oversee themselves. That doesn't make sense. And so this whole thing is ridiculous. And the assertion that immigration judges are the only ones that should be able to make rulings with regards to immigration policy is r- just ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that even this ridiculous Supreme Court, I would imagine, is not going to support that argument. Where to start with the things that Miller, who is not a lawyer but happy to play one on the White House driveway, probably doesn't know. As the Georgetown University law professor Steve Vladek aptly summarized, his argument is factually and legally nuts. Yes, yeah. Miller misunderstands the significance of the right of habeas corpus for starters, known as the Great Writ. That is the foundation of our entire legal system. It is the foundation, I would argue, of like modern human rights almost, right? Like the idea that you would attack habeas corpus is so beyond the pale. I would have never guessed. I would not have guessed a year ago that they would have that this would be on the table. I would have never guessed. Known as the Great Writ, it is an ancient right dating at least to the Magna Carta's declaration that no man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. The Supreme Court has described it as the fundamental instrument for safeguarding individual freedom against arbitrary and lawless state action. For the drafters of the Constitution, habeas was such a critical aspect of personal liberty that they put it in the original document, not waiting for the Bill of Rights, a point the court made in a 2008 decision establishing that the right extended to non-citizens held at Guantanamo. Miller's spin notwithstanding, the Constitution makes clear that the right to habeas corpus is the norm, not the exception. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Rebellion and invasion have very specific definitions. You can't just change the definition of the word invasion. That's not how this works. That provision is in Article 1, which outlines the powers of the legislature and illuminates the second thing that Miller got wrong. Only Congress has the power to suspend habeas corpus. The president can't act unilaterally. Yes, Lincoln did so in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. He was slapped down by Justice Roger B. Taney. Yes, that Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision. Taney wrote, I can see no ground whatever whatever. I can see no ground whatever for supporting that the president in any emergency or in any state of things can authorize the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. That seems like it makes sense to me. Why would the president have the power to unilaterally decide to suspend habeas corpus? That seems sort of antithetical to the whole like idea of the formation of this country, which was we don't want to have a king, right? We don't want to have a monarchy who just rules by virtue of bloodline. Um, wasn't that the whole point of the founding of this country, right? So it makes sense that makes sense to me. Um, it makes sense that you should and that you wouldn't need Congress to back this. Taney, in a practice that continued until the early 20th century, was sitting as a circuit justice at the time, and therefore his opinion is not a ruling of the court. Notably, Lincoln didn't appeal it to the full court, but he later defended his reasoning, explaining it in a message to Congress that, as the provision was plainly made for a dangerous emergency, it cannot be believed the framers of the instrument intended that in every case the danger should run its course until Congress could be called together, the very assembling of which might be prevented, as was intended in this case by the rebellion. Okay, so that makes sense as well. There are scenarios you can imagine where you would need to suspend habeas corpus or do some sort of big action like that, but Congress is unable to meet and properly authorize it. But then you could just have a provision that says, like, if Congress is unable to meet, then the power rests in the hands of the president. That would make sense to me. And then also have some sort of provision in there, obviously, that the president can't himself facilitate Congress not being able to meet. But I think that goes without saying. Although with this administration, nothing goes without saying. Even things that go with saying they're gonna just ignore sometimes. So I don't know. If you think presidential power to act remains a disputed question, consider this 2014 assessment from Amy Coney Barrett, who was a law professor at the time. Scholars and courts have overwhelmingly endorsed the position that Lincoln's unilateral suspension of the writ notwithstanding, the Constitution gives Congress the exclusive authority to decide when the predicates specified by the suspension clause are satisfied. Okay, so that's her saying that Congress is the only one that can make this decision, and that the president does not have the ability or the right to suspend habeas corpus unilaterally using just the executive. And the fact that Tony Barrett said that a few years ago means that I would expect her to hold that same position, on top of the fact that she is one of the few that's willing to go against the administration, a bit more willing than like Alito and Roberts. That brings us to Miller's third error, that Even assuming Trump could act on his own, the grounds for suspending habeas corpus exist. This is not Lincoln confronting the rebellion of the southern states. And consider the other instances in which presidents, acting on emergency powers delegated by Congress, have suspended habeas corpus. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, during Reconstruction era rebellions in South Carolina counties overtaken by the Ku Klux Klan, in the Civil War, and in the Philippines. In 1905, in the midst of the Moro Rebellion against American rule, ignore Miller's hyperventilating. The country is not now facing an invasion, much less one in which public safety requires suspension of the writ. Trump has invoked the 1978 Alien Enemies Act to round up and remove alleged members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. At least four federal judges, including one nominated by Trump and another by George W. Bush, have rejected that interpretation. Yeah, you can't just invade. Like I said a couple times now, the word invasion has a specific definition. Words have meanings. And the idea, but furthermore, put that aside for a second. The idea that like the the uh, the flow of immigrants into this country is an invasion, a la, Civil War Reconstruction Rebellion or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, is just like any sane, reasonable person can realize that's just ridiculous and wrong. Then there is Miller's baseless declaration that Article 3 judges aren't even allowed to be involved in immigration cases. That's evidently false in the cases involving the Alien Enemies Act. Last month, the Supreme Court instructed that challenges to Trump's actions had to be brought as habeas cases. More broadly, though, the Immigration and Nationality Act sends some cases to specialized immigration courts. It does not, as Miller claims, require Article 3 judges to butt out entirely. For example, in the case of Rumeysa Öztürk, the Turkish graduate student detained for writing an op-ed critical of Israel in the Tufts University student newspaper, the administration contended that the INA prohibited the federal court from considering her habeas petition. In a ruling last week, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit rejected that argument, saying that the government dramatically overstates the reach of the immigration law. A federal judge ordered Ozturk released after more than 6 weeks in detention. The law is nowhere near as definitive as Miller claims, and the notion of suspending habeas corpus is so outlandish that it's tempting to ignore his assertions, dismissing them as more Miller trolling. No doubt there is an element of rabble-rousing at work in his hyperbolic warnings that courts ruling against the administration in immigration cases are engaged in a judicial coup by a handful of Marxist judges, which can only be understood as an attack on democracy. That is, bro, come on now. Marxist judges, bro. Can you find a single judge in the United States sitting right now on a bench that self publicly and openly self-describes themselves as a Marxist? There is no way, okay? If you can find that for me, I'll Venmo you $20, okay? Because I almost guarantee you it doesn't exist. It's just so it's so ridiculous. It's the same. It's almost like it reeks of the same people that screech cultural Marxism when it doesn't mean anything. That doesn't It's just non-existent and it's just so silly. But there is something more meaningful going on here. The not so subtle implication is that judges ought to think twice about standing in the administration's way, lest they trigger a suspension of habeas corpus. Asked whether Trump would take that dramatic step, Miller offered, "Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not." In the administration's view, the only good court is a compliant court. That is very true. They seem to not respect legal analysis whatsoever. They seem to only care about meeting their ends. And if the court rules against them in some kind of way, they're regardless of the ruling, regardless of the court, they are going to and like an apolitical, uninformed person might argue, well, that's just the legal world, right? If you're that seems like just smart gamesmanship, right? Basically. But if you have any historical understanding of how presidents and the legal system has functioned up until now, you'll understand that the way that the Trump administration is actively attacking the courts is totally, it is not comparable to anything we've seen in the past. Um, their willingness to um, act in such dramatic bad faith to achieve their what I would call bad goals is uncomparable to anything we've seen before. In the administration's view, the only good court is a compliant court. That is not the way the Constitution works. Marbury v. Madison from 1803 dictates that courts emphatically have the last word on what the law requires. But for this administration, due process is worse than an inconvenience. It is an obstacle to be avoided at any cost because any review of the legality of Trump's actions might prevent him from carrying out expulsions at the dizzying pace he seeks. That is why the White House resorted to the unprecedented use of the Alien Enemies Act outside of wartime, and why it has been so desperate to prevent judges from getting to the merits of other cases, such as that of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, whom the administration sent in violation of a court order to a maximum security prison in his birth country of El Salvador. J. Harvey Wilkinson III, federal appeals court judge, made this point when he wrote of Abrego Garcia. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. As Wilkinson noted, a government confident of its position that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of the MS-13 gang would have nothing to fear from due process. Exactly, yeah. If they have sufficient evidence, then you would think that they would think that they would not only be willing, but they would want to prove it in court because there would be no question then. They don't, I would imagine that they do have planned controversies and sort of their political version of planned obsolescence. Like they absolutely stir the pot on purpose, but I would imagine that would like to have avoided all of this due process, habeas corpus nonsense because it's just a bad look. I would think like if they could create an alternate universe where they didn't have to do all of this, they would, and that ultimately this is a bad look, and that yeah, most of the cult members are not gonna give a shit, but that anybody who was sort of in betweeny and found themselves voting for Trump because maybe they're just more like a fiscally leaning conservative, but they don't agree with everything that he does. There's no way that this due process stuff looks good to them, and they know that. Habeas corpus and due process are intertwined. The right of the detained individual to seek review in court is a way of making certain that due process has been provided. Seemingly frantic to avoid having its actions subjected to scrutiny, the Trump White House is now weighing whether to trigger a constitutional earthquake. Even short of that, Miller's pushback pitch to the federal judiciary on habeas, of a piece with the administration's consistently thuggish language about rogue courts, is disturbing enough. The administration's bellicose stance against backfire with some judges, but it could also have the intended chilling effect. Chief Justice John Roberts is temporarily inclined to avoid a Lincoln-Taney showdown. Either way, this is a perilous moment. For all the extreme legal steps the administration has already deployed, suspending habeas corpus would be an act far more radical than any that has come before. That we are compelled to take Miller's suggestion seriously is a measure of the gravity of the threat to American democracy. Man, whoever wrote this article, they do words good. What's the name of this person? Ruth Marcus. Ruth, you do words good. I don't know. Ruth could be a girl or a guy. But Ruth, you do words good, all right? All right, Jones? All right, Jones, you do words good. Yeah, I like this article. Gives just the right amount of historical context without getting too buried into like a history lesson. Um, Points out the cynical framing and bad faith nature of Miller and of the administration's approach to the legislative branch of the government in general, um, and points out the completely legal reasoning that is presented on this, the completely devoid from any like precedent or any legal logic or reasoning that makes sense. This article is well put together. I think I have one more article talking about the suspension of habeas corpus. Do I? No, I don't. Okay. Well, I think that was about it. Don't know if there's a whole lot more to say about that. It's just really scary that, they're even discussing it, that you have the attack, the trolling Rottweiler that is Miller coming out and making statements like this. I think it is good. I think the speculation that they're doing it cynically and on purpose and that this is more arc than bite, is probably true, but I think it is absolutely still worth talking about and still we should still take it with the utmost seriousness, especially considering the crazy nonsense that this administration has been engaged in for the last 4 months or whatever. With especially with that in mind, we really should be like even the stuff we think is ridiculous and impossible and all posture and all chest puffing, we should really be looking at because you never know with this administration. This administration is like somebody with like a serious mental disorder, somebody with like serious schizophrenia or serious psychopathy, where when you're next to them, when you're interacting with them, they're that kind of person that gives you the vibe that they could just snap at any moment and they might just start swinging at you or something, even though you've done nothing but be nice to them. That is what this administration is. They're the psycho. All right, so I know almost nothing about this story. I saw this article's headline in my Reddit feed yesterday or the day before, a few days ago or something. Um, it seems somewhat self-explanatory, but um, let's see what it has to say. U.S. President Donald Trump criticized the legislation signed by President Joe Biden aimed at expanding access to high-speed internet, calling it racist and unconstitutional. I've spoken with my wonderful Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutkin, and we agreed that the Biden Harris so called Digital Equity Act is totally unconstitutional, Trump wrote on Truth Social. The legislation, which is part of Biden's broader infrastructure plan, is designed to improve internet access for various groups, including veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, and those in rural communities. However, Trump took particular issue with provisions that aim to enhance internet access for racial and ethnic minorities. He continued, no more woke handouts based on race. The Digital Equity Program is a racist and illegal $2.5 billion giveaway. I am ending this immediately and saving taxpayers billions of dollars. The law seeks to improve internet access. So the idea that he's saving taxpayers dollars, yes, he's saving them dollars, but they're giving up a service. So, you know, it's not in a vacuum. The law seeks to improve internet access in underserved areas. Despite Trump's claims, the New York Times reported that the legislation doesn't specifically prioritize race, only stating that the program could assist racial minorities. It also includes a non-discrimination clause inspired by the 1964 Civil Rights Act that ensures individuals cannot be excluded from the program based on their race, religion, national origin, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, or disability. What is the Digital Equity Act? The Digital Equity Act allocates $60 million in grants to states and territories to develop plans for equitable internet access and $2.5 billion to help implement those plans. Some funds have already been distributed to conservative rural states like Indiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Iowa, and Kansas. Additional funding, approved during the final days of the Biden administration, has yet to be dispersed. The initiative is overseen by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration and the Department of Commerce. If Trump moves to cancel the funding, it would likely face significant legal challenges. The Trump administration had some success temporarily halting grants for programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but in March, a federal appeals court upheld a lower court's decision to block a freeze on funding for states, noting that the freeze could harm those reliant on the federal assistance. Internet swiftly react The internet swiftly reacted to Trump's comment. A user said, "Another gift for Elon. Starlink is one of the options in rural areas. By defunding broadband access, it gives Starlink a competitive advantage since its speeds will not be impacted oligarchy and kleptocracy." That's a very good point here. This is a huge conflict of interest that if it existed during the Biden administration or during a theoretical or hypothetical Harris administration, that the conservatives and Elon and Trump and all those gaggle of idiots would lose their minds. But when it's Elon, when it's Daddy Trump, we don't really care because they don't care about that because they don't actually care about this type of corruption or like wealth inequality or any of those issues. They don't actually care about them. They think it's fine. They think it's like a virtue. They think it's just sort of a perk of being powerful, right? You earned your position, to become a senator or whatever, and that whatever cynical, Elon earned his position to be. He wouldn't have been picked to be the Doge guy unless he was so smart and so successful. Another noted, he's canceling a program for mostly white rural Republicans because it had the word equity in the name. That is, yeah, that's actually probably that's probably true. They probably just went equity bad because they're starting to see who he is, so he's got to strangle their access to information. Claimed a user. A user. Okay, that's a little bit far-fetched. The idea that let Elon. So wait, Elon sees the backlash and as a result wants to cut people's access to internet. That's really far-fetched. It's one of those like haha cynical social media comments, but it's really just if we're gonna take it seriously, it's silly. A user explained Trump can't have his base supporters having too much access to information that might conflict with what they hear on conservative talk radio and entertainment news. Meanwhile, another user added, I work in telecom with Trump idolizers. I saw this being said once before and they thought nothing of it. Our company in particular relies on new builds and specifically for areas that would benefit from this. They are and I will be affected by what they voted for. Pay for this is simple. The play for this is simple. It all leads back to Elon and Starlink. The funding for this will be diverted to Starlink for a subpar service that is more expensive and less reliable. Yeah, yeah, I they're gonna defund our plan to expand and improve broadband, and then point at broadband and be like, "Oh, look at how bad it is, man. Look at how bad it is," and then use that as a pretext to do some sort of corrupt thing with Elon um, and Starlink. That seems entirely plausible to me. It's one of those conspiracies where I would call it a light conspiracy theory, but with this administration, I think it is not even a conspiracy theory. I think it is a totally reasonable thing to assume based on what this administration has done thus far. President Trump ripped former President Biden's high speed internet program Thursday, vowing to end what he called a racist and illegal initiative. All right, let's pause for a second. I'm going to talk about the white Afrikaans refugees from South Africa here a little bit later in the show. And so it's just so like my understanding of that situation is that it is a somewhat overtly racist one, and that the idea that he's going to call this program to expand broadband and access to internet in rural areas racist and illegal at the same time he, is doing the refugee thing with the white Afrikaans from South Africa or whatever. Um, it's just so it's beyond cynical. It's just so like nothing matters anymore. Nobody cares. Like especially conservatives and Republicans. They seem to just not care about anything anymore. Trump said he spoke with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick about the Biden-era Digital Equity Act, which allocated about $2.75 billion for programs that provide technology, including the internet and skills for all Americans. We, Trump and Lutnick, agree that the Biden and Harris so-called Digital Equity Act is totally unconstitutional, Trump wrote in a Truth Social post Thursday. No more woke handouts based on race. The Digital Equity Program is a racist and illegal $2.5 billion giveaway. I am ending this immediately and saving taxpayers billions of dollars. Biden signed the Digital Equity Act into law in 2021 as part of a $1 trillion infrastructure package to further the former administration's Internet for All initiative. Interesting, I guess a funny note here is that just think about how Trump ran on infrastructure for a while there, especially during his first term. But he also ran partially on his second term and was unable to, and will likely be for this term, be unable to actually pass any infrastructure legislation. But then Biden was able to get a full $1 trillion large scale infrastructure bill through. Um, the contrast is stark. It set aside about $60 million for grants to states and territories to come up with ways to improve access to technology, along with another 2.5 billion to implement the plans. The Trump administration has worked to roll back several diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The Internet for All program was intended to apply to a variety of groups. Senator Patty Murray, the original author of the Digital Equity Act, swiped back at Trump's post, writing in a statement, "As usual, the president has no idea what he's talking about. I wrote the Digital Equity Act to help close the digital divide in America. It's about making sure seniors can get online and equipping every student in every classroom with the tools they need to succeed, whether that's a hotspot to take home or a laptop," Murray wrote. My law, I think something that older people might not understand. I think most probably do at this point, but like you need access to the internet in 2025 to be a functioning member of 21st century society in America. You need access to internet. You need consistent, regular access to internet. And I would go even a step further and say, not only do you really need a cell phone. You can kind of get away with a home phone. You at bare minimum need a phone number, and the cell phone I would almost say is a necessity as well. It makes it a million times easier than having a home line. Um, so and I think maybe a lot of older people can glibly dismiss that and be like, "Oh, I didn't have a phone growing up. I didn't have a laptop. Why do these kids need it? I did just fine without it." But like, this is not 1970. We don't live in the same world. Nobody does physical job applications anymore, right? If you want to apply for a job, it has to be online, right? If you're going to find a job, it has to be online. Nobody does physical job postings anymore anywhere. How are you possibly going to physically go find a job posting? You got to go online to find that shit. You got to do everything online. So makes sense to me. It's more of a necessity. It's more of a necessity in the sense that it's a utility rather than a service. My law provides maximal flexibility to cities, states, and tribes so every local community can decide for themselves how they invest digital equity dollars. That's why it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, she continued. The grants were appropriated through Congress, and their potential cancellation is likely to face legal challenges. Murray argued Trump would be stealing from the American people should he refuse to spend the appropriated funding. It is absolutely insane that resources meant to help red and blue communities, everyone from local school districts and libraries to workforce training programs and tribes, close the digital divide. Close the digital divide will be illegally blocked because the president doesn't like the word equity, Murray continued. So this has been all over the news the last couple of days. The Trump administration, ever since they got into office in January, has been overtly and very strongly anti-immigration and anti-refugee, basically in every capacity. They haven't shown any willingness to be anything but like mean and cruel to people who are trying to come into this country. Um, the only things welcoming, open arms to bring people in sort of thing that they've done is offer the $5 million green card. You can spend $5 million and get basically American citizenship. Um, aside from that, they have done nothing but restrict people's ability to come to this country through refugee, through asylum, through legal, proper, immigration. So that's why this is such a big story. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a real story. I mean, if you're a refugee and you have a legitimate claim to come to the U.S., we have plenty of space. Refugees are good for us. They help the economy. Um, there's no reason that we should say no. But this is an important story because it's within the context of what they have been doing with regards to everybody else that's trying to claim refugee status. An administration official's attempt to explain Donald Trump's decision to allow white South African refugees is an exception to his ban on asylum seekers revealed just how racist the policy really is. So I didn't know that I guess they completely yeah, I think they put a complete ban or a complete suspension on all asylum seeking at all in the United States. So if you wanted to cross the border into the United States and then claim asylum, they'd just be like, sorry, we're not doing that right now. You're not allowed to do the asylum process. I think that's what is happening right now. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau was greeted was greeting the group of 59 Afrikaners who arrived in Washington Monday when he told a reporter that Afrikaners had received an exception to the president's order because they could be assimilated easily because they could be assimilated easily into the United States. So, yeah, so this is corporate jargon, buzzword speak for they're white. I mean, they're really. I am never the one to be doing this. I think it's so lazy to pull out the whole cis white man. Oh, you're cis white man. You know. I think all of that is really cringy and stupid. But it is undeniable that when they're using the words assimilated easily here, they're talking about them being white. Because look, these people grew up in, these people live and grew up in South Africa. That's a very different culture. So like, there's no reason to think that just by virtue of them being white, that their culture is going to be any closer to ours. He wouldn't be saying the same thing about a black South African. He would assert, oh, their culture's different and that they couldn't assimilate easily. They could assimilate, I'm sure, but that it wouldn't be an easy assimilation like he's claiming with these people. It is so blatantly obvious that that assimilated easily parentheses white. Like I hate it's so lazy when people pull up the race card. 99% of the time when people talk about race within the context of politics, it's just lazy and stupid and doesn't make sense. And it's some cringy pink-haired leftist that's talking about cis white men. But like this really is parentheses white people. The reporter had asked why Trump had chosen to prioritize Afrikaners, white descendants of mainly Dutch colonizers in South Africa, over other refugees from countries such as Afghanistan. Landau explained that Trump's ban on virtually all refugees was subject from the very beginning to exceptions where it was determined that this would be in the interest of the United States. One of some of the criteria are making sure that refugees did not pose any challenge to our national security and that they could be assimilated easily into our country, Landau said. So they mention Afghanistan here. Interesting that they do that because they removed the ability for removed the blah 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 blah. They removed the temporary protected status of Afghan soldiers um, following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban taking over. Um, People who served in the Afghan military had a special claim to asylum in the United States, a special claim to refugee status, which made sense, right? That's what all the Republicans and conservatives were screaming about whenever Biden pulled out, right? That we're leaving the Afghans high and dry, that they're, that basically, do you not care about the Afghan soldiers there that are, blah, blah, blah. That was a big point that they were making. That was a big point that they were making at the time, but that's completely undermined by their whole removing of the temporary protective status of these Afghan soldiers. Um, just thought I'd mention that really quick. Um, the deputy secretary's language indicates that the Trump administration is willing to admit refugees who are more culturally and ethnically cohesive with the predominantly white U.S. population. Also, pause. This whole idea of assimilation is just like, to me, always seems like a pretty poorly thought out argument, right? Like, why is assimilation necessarily good? So many people run with this by just like default. But like let's actually try and flesh out the argument for a second. What is the problem with not assimilating? What is the problem with having more people in the US speaking Spanish or more people in the US speaking Arabic or more people in the US living in little, their own little communities, because that tends to be what people do. Um, what is really the problem with all of this? To the extent that like a pocket of a specific type of community might be in a poor area and might cause crime, but that's not by virtue of it being an unassimilated community. That's by virtue of it being poor or, not having access to resources or whatever. I speculate that some of this default belief in the power of assimilation and the power of a homogenous society comes from a misunderstanding of already existing homogenous societies. They might look at a country like Japan and go, they don't have a lot of immigrants. They're almost all Japanese, and the crime is really low, and yada yada. And incorrectly make the assessment that the homogeneous nature of the society, the lack of diversity, the the amount of assimilation that has occurred is directly linked to the success, to the cohesion, to the safety, and to the well functioning of the society. But that is all of those things, like the how a function how well a society functions, its economics, all of these things are extremely complex things. These are things that operate on a global context and a domestic context. There are a million different factors that go into why Japan is a safe country and why they don't have a lot of immigration and why all of these things are true, and also why it isn't like Japan's lower crime rate and their higher, like that it being a safer place generally, is not necessarily a result of the homogenous nature of the society. There's no reason to think that if it became less homogenous, that it would suddenly become more violent or something. There's no evidence of that. There's evidence that if it became more poor or more inequality was fleshed out, or uh, uh, there was legal persecution or various forms of soft and of explicit and implicit oppression. Um, there are just so many different factors that go into what makes a country successful, and what makes a group of people successful. That this default towards assimilation being good is just weird, and it just doesn't seem very well thought out to me. I could potentially hear out some of these arguments if they actually had some statistical backing. And maybe they do, but I haven't heard any of these arguments actually presented with real statistical backing. Just sort of like I said, this like default deference towards the idea that assimilation is good and that it's something that we should strive for. The deputy secretary's language indicates that the Trump administration is willing to admit refugees who are more culturally and ethnically cohesive with the predominantly white U.S. population. Trump has repeatedly attempted to blow up perceived cultural differences between U.S. citizens and immigrants as a basis for installing blatantly racist immigration policies. Landau's comments come just months after Trump and his campaign team attempted to smear Haitian immigrant populations, baselessly claiming that a group of refugees in Springfield, Ohio, had begun cooking up their neighbors' pets. J.D. Vance even targeted the children of undocumented immigrants across the country for not being fluent in English, claiming they were a strain on the American education system, which the administration obviously cares so much about, given they gutted the federal agency that funds it. Yeah, yeah, good thing they brought that up. In reality, Haitian migrants in Springfield created an economic revival in the struggling industrial city, and local officials in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, and another of the towns Trump had targeted with racist smears, insisted that Trump was lying and that the language barrier for immigrant students was not an issue. Trump's blatantly racist rhetoric has gone on to inform his administration's sinister immigration agenda, which seeks to strip immigrants, both documented and undocumented, of their legal protections and deport or exile them to foreign countries. In short, any claims about wanting to ease assimilation are just as pathetic as Trump's claims about immigrants eating cats and dogs. 100%. Not only is there not much backing for the idea of assimilation itself, but it is extremely clear that their use of the word, their very specific phrasing of assimilated easily, is very clearly they liked these people because they're white, and that's why they chose them. All right, um, let's. I have another article talking about this, so hopefully this will give us a bit more information. President Trump signed an executive order in February establishing refugee status for Afrikaners, the white ethnic minority in South Africa that created and led the system of racial segregation known as apartheid. As part of the executive order, the Trump administration created an expedited path for Afrikaners to resettle in the United States, even as the administration has barred most refugees from countries afflicted by war and famine. Yeah, it's so weird that like part of the reasoning that he was giving for accepting this specific group of people is like they're being killed, they're being targeted for their race, they're being killed. How could you not? for not for their race. They're being targeted for who they are, their socioeconomic group or whatever. How could you possibly how can you claim that this group of people, which to my understanding are not actually being targeted or killed in the way that he's suggesting, um, how could you say no to somebody who's like, I'm being persecuted because I'm a gay person in one of these Arab countries and they literally want to kill me if they discover I'm gay? How could you say no to that? An example of them literally being targeted for who they are. And these people who I'll explain, who are being targeted because of history. So these people, so what the Trump administration is really mad about and what these people are really mad about is that my understanding is in South Africa, they are doing a sort of land reform type of legislation there. That my understanding is that somewhere around 7 to 9% of the population of South Africa are these white Afrikaners, these Dutch descendant Europeans. And that they own over 70% of the land in South Africa currently. In 2025, they own over 70% of that land. And that seems like a pretty serious problem, right? I mean, eh, I'm not gonna say like obviously the white Afrikaners, seems like such a stupid name for it. It just feels really cringy saying it. But the white Afrikaners, um, I understand that their they don't know they have no relation to what their great great grandpa did or whatever, and the fact like they are not personally responsible for the scenario that they're in. I totally accept and understand that argument, but that doesn't mean that South Africa can't engage in some sort of land reform, and that the idea that they're going to redistribute some of this land seems almost essential to this country functioning properly moving forward. How can this country how can this country hope to develop in any meaningful way if over 70% of the land and therefore access to like land is power, okay? How can you expect the country I don't know, that seems like it is a recipe for disaster, and it seems completely logical to me that they would want to redistribute some of that land. My understanding further is that most of that land or all of it being targeted for redistribution is unused land. It's not like they're going to these people's houses and kicking them out and saying, "We want the specific acre that your house is sitting on, we want that acre, and we're taking that one." My understanding is that's not what they're doing. They're saying, yeah, you can keep your shit, but that 100 acres over there that you're just doing nothing with, that's sitting there open, that people want to build houses on or do farming on or whatever, yeah, we're going to take that and redistribute that. It seems completely consistent with this administration that they would consider a land redistribution piece of legislation like this akin to genocide. Like it sounds so ridiculous to say it like that, but I actually think that makes so much sense. They worship the dollar. They worship the idea of capitalism, the idea of, might makes right. Um, and as a result, they think that anything that upends the natural order of things, just how they are, and how the market or whatever distributes things is inherently evil. And so I think they genuinely, or at least some of the weirdos in this administration, view this as um, just as bad as like targeted killings, which is just bananas. The idea that you would argue that the confiscating of property um, let's say it was even their house. Let's go as far and to say they are taking the land that their house is on in their house. The idea that that is the same as genocide is ridiculous, or the being targeted like to be killed is utterly ridiculous. But it's clear that that's not what all of this is about. It's clear that there was some of the really influential people in the background clearly have some very strange racist ideas, and that they were able to convince Trump that this is fine. And there's just enough plausible deniability in all of this that they're able to run with it. They're able to say, "Oh, you're against refugees," but they would have, but I thought you guys were for refugees. It's sort of like it creates a reverse racism scenario where they can almost claim that the people criticizing this are racist because like, oh, are you criticizing this because it's only white people? Huh? Are you so woke and obsessed with race and identity politics that you're only going to support them bringing in black and brown people, that you wouldn't support them bringing in white people? I guarantee you there are a whole bunch of conservative Kool-Aid drinkers that are of that mindset right now. As part of the executive order, the Trump administration created an expedited path for Afrikaners to resettle in the United States, even as the administration has barred most refugees from countries afflicted by war and famine. While waiting at the airport in Johannesburg, the passengers said the U.S. Embassy had instructed them not to speak with the news media. The first group of Afrikaners arrived in the United States on May 12th. Who are the Afrikaners? The Afrikaners who arrived in the United States on Monday are the descendants of the European colonizers who came to South Africa approximately 4 centuries ago. They later created the system of apartheid in 1948. Decades after the end of apartheid, some Afrikaners now say they are being denied jobs and have been targeted by violence because of their race. No white person in their right mind would stay in this country, said Jaco van der Merwe, 52, an Afrikaner living in Johannesburg. I believe South Africa is finished. 49 Afrikaners, including parents and children, boarded a flight to Johannesburg in Johannesburg to the United States on Sunday night, according to a spokesman for South Africa's airport authority. The U.S. State Department said in March that it had received 8,000 inquiries from people seeking information about the refugee program. It is unclear if the U.S. government will admit more families. Organizations such as the Amerikaners, have been set up to help support disenfranchised South Africans seeking a new future in the United States. Some leading Afrikaner advocates say they would prefer Mr. Trump help their cause at home rather than offer refugee status in the United States. Yeah, that seems like a much more holistic, comprehensive way to deal with this problem. If you actually cared about this problem, to go there and provide some sort of support or whatever to help fix the problem there. Because not only would it fix the problem for the 49 people or the 50 whatever people that you are like bringing here on an airplane, helps it for all the others that you aren't bringing here on an airplane, right? So, and anybody else that gets caught up in it as well that isn't explicitly one of these white Afrikaners, because like what I heard earlier was that mm, there South Africa has a really, really high murder rate, and that of that murder rate, farmers make a very like a 0.2 percentage of all the murders done are on farms, and of that 0.2%, even a smaller fraction are of actually of white Afrikaners and white people and whatnot. Forgot where I was going with all that. Much of the discontent among Afrikaners blah, 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 blah. Much of the discontent among Afrikaners centers on their experience in rural communities and frustration over land ownership. Many Afrikaners farmed to make a living. During apartheid, the government denied black South Africans the right to own prime agricultural land. That meant that almost all of the country's large-scale commercial farms were white-owned enterprises. This remains true today. Although white South only 7% of the population, they own farmland that covers about half the exactly what I said earlier. The South African government has tried to address this inequality with various land reform programs, including the recent Expropriation Act, which allows the government to acquire privately owned land in the public interest without providing compensation to the owner. Yeah, so this is the land redistribution program that I was talking about that they ultimately, I think, have the biggest problem with, and that if it didn't exist, wouldn't all of this wouldn't be happening. When Mr. Trump signed the executive order announcing his plans to resettle Afrikaner refugees, he said it was because the South African government had created a system that racially disfavored landowners. Wait, but a landowner isn't a race. Racially disfavored landowners? But not all the landowners are white, just most of them. I'm so confused. This administration has completely lost their ability to put together a sentence. It seems like to put together any like semblance of a logical argument. It seems like there's just there's nobody with a brain left in the room. There's no adults left in the room. Refugees can often wait years before they are processed and approved to travel to the United States. The Afrikaners who arrived on Monday had to wait no more than 3 months. The president has equated efforts by the South African government to undo racial inequalities to anti-white discrimination. He said on Monday that the Afrikaners were victims of a genocide. Exactly what I said. They see this land redistribution program because they worship the dollar, they worship capitalism, they worship the idea of might makes right. They think that this land redistribution program is akin to actually killing people. That's how distorted, how That's how like distorted their view of not only money and systems in the world, but their view of humanity and people and empathy. That they conflate humans' life with land, and not even land that they're using, just land they're holding, is just so like it is like peak rich guy brain. Like you come from billionaire brain perspective, what benefits me and only me at the expense of everybody else. Like it's what it feels like. Farmers are being killed, he told Reported. They happen to be white. Whether they are white or black makes no difference to me. White farmers are being brutally killed and the land is being confiscated in South Africa. Police data do not support that narrative, showing that killings on farms are rare and that the victims are mostly black. That supports my understanding. Yeah, I saw a breakdown of it, but it was basically like of the 50,000 murders this year, there were 50 that were of on farms, and of those of those on farms, five were of landowners, and then another 10 were of the employees, and another five were of people just living there, and that the employees are almost all black, and that only a handful of all of the people in this equation are these white Afrikaners, and that far more regular black South African citizens have been caught up in all of this and have been killed in the process. South African officials have described the administration's moves as politically motivated. Mr. Trump has criticized the South African government for its ties to Iran and for bringing a genocide case against Israel in the International Court of Justice over the war in Gaza. It is almost regrettable. It is most regrettable that it appears that the resettlement of South Africans to the United States under the guise of being refugees is entirely politically motivated and designed to question South Africa's constitutional democracy. Crispin Feary, Crispin Feary, a spokesman for the South African government, said in a statement. I'm just thinking for a second, imagine if like China came here and resettled a whole bunch, 50 Americans to China or something. I feel like that would be a hilarious political stunt that it is ripe for the picking right now. It wouldn't have to be China. I think China is just in that right spot of like almost adversarial to the United States, but not in like a violent or really dangerous sort of way. It's almost like a fake rivalry. Um, but really, any European or any first world country could do this, and I think it would be a politically astute move. It would be really funny, and uh, it wouldn't. It would surprise me if they do that because usually, like most people at the tops of these governments are too big of babies to actually try and do something fun like that, or to try and make actual political moves. To actually play the game, they don't actually want to play the game, and so I don't think this is going to happen. But I think it would be really funny. It'd be really funny if that happened. Mr. Trump said on Monday that the United States would grant citizenship to the Afrikaners. The administration plans to rely on a refugee office in the Department of Health and Human Services to assist with resettlement. The office has reached out to refugee organizations in recent days to prepare for the arrival of the Afrikaners, according to a department memo obtained by the New York Times. According to the memo, the administration will help the Afrikaners find temporary or long term housing and basic home furnishings, essential household items, and cleaning supplies. The administration is also planning to help the Afrikaners secure groceries, weather appropriate clothing, diapers, formula, hygiene products, and prepaid phones that support the day to day well being of households, the memo said. Wow, look at all this support that they're like bending. It seems like they're probably going to bend over backwards to try and provide for these people, but then they're like antithetically, they are principally against providing any of these same things to actual American citizens. It is so like I keep saying that the thinking is twisted, but it's not twisted, because saying the thinking is twisted implies like they're trying to work towards a good faith goal, but like they're getting caught up, they're getting mixed up in the process. That's actually not what's happening. It's purposeful, it's cynical, it's explicit, it is strategic. And yeah, this all seems very clearly racist to me. I don't say that lightly. I think it's extremely lazy when people do that. And 9 times out of 10, when somebody screams racism in politics, when I see them do it, it's not actually true and that they're just being weird. But this is absolutely, when you put it in the context of what the administration has been doing for refugees and immigrants for the last 4 months, this is absolutely a racist decision without question. So I just read an article on the show a few days, maybe a week ago, talking about Texas's plan to remove the farm bill or to rescind the farm bill. The farm bill, I believe it's the federal farm bill, allowed for the selling of certain hemp products and really, really low grade THC products, like under 0.1% or whatever. They only really allowed that qualification in because to even sell hemp products at all, it's impossible to completely remove any trace of THC from hemp. Most hemp does not have enough THC in it to be psychoactive if you were to smoke it or ingest it. But it is impossible to remove all of it. And so to be allowed to use hemp, you have to be allowed to have some small percentage of it. Well, with that came CBD, came Delta 8, Delta 9, came all these synthetic and pseudo real THC alternatives. And they absolutely took over the market in Texas because we don't have any alternative. Because it's either go get illegal black market weed from your local weed dealer, or and risk jail or something, or go to one of these smoke shops and pick up a Delta 8, Delta 9 THCA cart that pretty much, to most non-regular smokers feels almost exactly the same and will be more than sufficient, to get them a bit inebriated. Um, and so my understanding was that that was looking good, that there was enough support in the House, Senate, and by the governor to actually get that passed, to get the ban passed, and that it would basically shut down overnight um, this like pseudo THC market that we have in Texas. But then I saw this article just a couple days ago that completely undermines it and shows a bill coming through the House that has the exact opposite intentions. Its intentions are to expand access to medical marijuana, not restrict it. In Texas, we technically have a medical marijuana program. It's basically non-existent though, because it only allows for a handful of extremely debilitating diseases like serious epilepsy or like stage 4 cancer or whatever. And even then, when you do have the medical card, it only allows for THC products up to like 1 or 2% or whatever. Basically, like not enough to matter. Like it so low that you even question why they made this bill in the first place. Like the bill is almost entirely symbolic. My understanding is that there isn't a single proper legal medical dispensary in Texas because of that exact reason. Because why would anybody do that? And so my understanding is this bill that they're bringing forward will expand the number of diagnoses that are eligible for medical marijuana, for a medical marijuana card, as well as hopefully expand the percentages and allowances for what, medical marijuana card holders can actually purchase. As well as I saw something that I would potentially have a big problem with, and it's that creating a different standard. I saw something about like veterans don't have any standard, that like if you're a regular citizen, you have to get diagnosed with one of these conditions to be given a medical marijuana card, but that if you're a veteran, you don't have to be diagnosed with anything. You could just claim it, that there are no restrictions. That seems very strange to me, and I'm hoping that this article will flesh out that a bit more. The Texas House of Representatives has given initial approval to a bill that would significantly expand the state's medical marijuana program. After clearing committee last week, the bipartisan legislation from Representatives Ken King and Penny Morales Shaw passed the full House on second reading in a 118 to 16 vote on Monday. It will need a final third reading vote before potentially moving to the Senate. Wow, that's a huge margin to win by, 118 to 16. I had no idea. This completely undermines everything that I heard about the other bill that was looking to restrict the medical marijuana, or not the medical marijuana market, the fake marijuana market, basically. The measure would expand the types of products patients could buy and also add multiple qualifying conditions for people to become registered patients. In 2015, Texas passed the Compassionate Use Act that allowed patients with epilepsy to access low THC cannabis. Since then, that's the like performative fake medical bill that I was talking about, that basically it creates such unreasonable conditions that nobody's going to use it. Since then, the program has been expanded to include additional medical conditions, but Texans still struggle to get access to the medicine uh, they're legally allowed to receive, King said on the floor. There are not enough dispensing organizations licensed in the state, and current law limits how and where the products can be stored and distributed. Specifically, the measure would allow patients to access cannabis patches, lotions, suppositories, approved inhalers, nebulizers, and vaping devices. The currently limited list of qualifying conditions would be expanded to include would be chronic pain, glaucoma, traumatic brain injury, spinal neuropathy, Crohn's disease, or other inflammatory bowel disease, degenerative disc disease, and any terminal illness for patients receiving hospice or palliative care. This is the part. So they do have this part. This is the part that I was weirded out about. Military veterans would be able to become registered cannabis patients for any medical condition, and the Texas Department of State Health Services would also be authorized for further expand the list. That seems very, very weird to me. I what is the reasoning behind that? I'm trying to conceive of the reasoning behind why a veteran should be exempt from these qualifications, but a regular citizen shouldn't. What about being in the military would make you what? Less I don't even know what I can't even come up with a hypothetical like funny argument as to why this would make sense. Like what's like a funny argument I can present for this? Okay, so this argument doesn't make any sense, but like let's just roll with it here. The lawmakers are okay with you getting cannabis for any medical condition, but that they think that people are willing to lie about a lot of other conditions. And so they listed the conditions that people they think that they are unwilling or unable to lie about, and that they think by virtue of being in the military, people are less willing and able to lie, and therefore we can trust them on their own self-diagnoses about these other conditions that we wouldn't trust the citizens. That's the only reasoning I can possibly come up with, and it's so stupid, it makes my brain hurt. So, like, this seems indicative of just, like, blind veteran worship that I kind of find so frustrating sometimes, this way that we need to, like, worship veterans in this country, or, like, it's this political performance that, like, not only Republican but the Democrats and Republicans both engage in. I look, I think it is definitely virtuous to wanna to be willing to sacrifice yourself to save other people, to protect your country or whatever. Certainly a virtuous, uh good thing that we should recognize. But I think something to also keep in mind is that that is not why the majority of people are in the army today. The majority, if you poll people why they're in the army today, why they're in the military today, most of them say for the benefits. They say for the free college, they say for the health care, they say for the pension, they say for the long-term support that it gives you in various ways. That is the main reason they are going to do it. Not because like they're like, oh, I want to protect the country, or oh, like I think my life is less valuable than other people, or like I care about more other people more than me, or whatever. None of that is the reason. I guess what I'm saying is, if somebody is in the military for the exact same reasons that somebody would say go work at McDonald's, does it really? Are they really like doing anything special? Are they really doing anything special? I really question that, and, like, I don't think it's parse out combat roles and those in non-combat roles, because they all play a hand in functioning of the military, whatever, right? The guy driving the supply truck is just as important as the guy shooting the gun. The guy shooting the gun could not shoot the gun if it wasn't for the guy driving the supply truck. But the same thing could be said for the McDonald's employee, right? Like, McDonald's functioning as a restaurant is part of our functioning as a society. If McDonald's wasn't there, a lot of people would go hungry or wouldn't have access to food, or yada yada yada, and so things would have to change. And so that McDonald's employee is an essential part of the functioning of society, just as the military is. And so Now, obviously, you could replace McDonald's with a lot of things, and it'd be harder to replace the military. But the argument is basically that, like, most people are not joining the military for altruistic reasons. They're joining the military for selfish reasons. And I'm not saying selfish in a negative way, because is it a negative way when the McDonald's worker or the CEO or the, software developer goes to work, for a modest wage or a retirement package or whatever? No, but it shows that, like, I feel like that makes this weird worship misplaced. If a person actually is joining the military for purely altruistic reasons, then I think the whole thank you for your service, maybe even giving them special benefits like they're exempt from this medical marijuana rules or whatever, might make sense to me. But because most people are joining the military for the exact same reasons that you would become a software developer or you would join the construction firm, is just, it seems so weird to me. And it seems like one of those things where it's like people are afraid to question. If you even start to talk about it like I am, some people will get angry at you and think like you're anti-military or you hate the troops or something, which is just anti-intellectual. Okay, that's just so silly. Anyways, I've spent too long on this. Let's move on. HB 46 would additionally mandate that the Department of Public Safety issue 11 dispensary license. Blah, blah, blah. HB 46 would additionally mandate that the Department of Public Safety issue 11 dispensary licenses within the 11 designated public health regions across the state. It would further allow dispensaries to open satellite locations if approved. An amendment that was adopted on the floor would grandfather existing medical cannabis dispensary satellite locations, ensure a competitive business licensing application process, create a lifeline for when new licenses must be issued, amend background check rules, allow physicians to determine dosage, and remove a 1.2 gram limit for possession by patients and instead let doctors recommend any amount they see fit. Second Amendment approved by members would require doctors who issue medical cannabis recommendations to report them to the state's prescription drug monitoring system. That seems like it makes sense to me. If you're going to if you're going to treat it medically, treat it like as if it's another drug with medicinal purposes, then yeah, you should report it just like you should have to report your usage of Viagra or whatever, or prescription Viagra. If ultimately enacted, the bill would significantly build upon Texas's current limited medical marijuana program, which allows patients with one of 8 qualifying conditions access certain non-smokable cannabis products containing no more than 0.5% by dry weight. This kind of comprehensive expansion of the Texas Compassionate Use Program is a long time coming, Heather Fazio, director of the Texas Cannabis Policy Center, said in a press release. Since its inception, TCUP has been unreasonably restrictive for both patients and operators. We applaud Chairman King and the Texas House for taking a real step towards a more inclusive program for sick Texans. Fazio supports blah, blah, blah. The legislation is advancing months after DPS released a report advising that the state's currently limited medical marijuana system does not provide for statewide access for patients, and recommending that the number of licensed dispensaries be significantly expanded to meet demand. But like, what demand really is there if the product limit is at what, 0.5% THC? Like, what can you possibly make with that? You're gonna have to keep making some weird delta 8, delta 9 THCA derivatives with that instead of the actual thing, which people want. A recent poll found that 4 in 5 Texas voters want to see marijuana legalized in some form. A recent poll found that 4 in 5 Texas voters want to see marijuana legalized in some form, and most also want to see regulations around cannabis relaxed. Meanwhile, in Texas, a House committee approved a Senate-passed bill earlier this month that would prohibit cities from putting any citizen initiative on local ballots that would decriminalize marijuana, other controlled substances, as several localities have already done despite lawsuits from the state attorney general. Okay, yeah, so that aligns with what I mentioned earlier, where there was a bill just like a week ago that they apparently were almost set to pass, and that was like poised to go through both the House, Senate, and the governor, to restrict the sort of weird pseudo THC market that we have in Texas right now. Uh, Under the proposal, state law would be amended to say that local entities may not place an item on a ballot, including a municipal charter or charter amendment, that would provide that the local entity will not fully enforce state drug laws. So my understanding is that most of the major cities in Texas have decriminalized um, marijuana. I believe Dallas, Austin, Houston, and maybe a few other places like I think Denton did as well. And I believe the way that they're doing it is basically like saying any amount, any possession amount under a certain threshold. I don't know what the threshold is. It's probably like an ounce or a couple grams of concentrate or something. But if you're under that threshold, that the city will not use police resources to try and go after you or prosecute you or whatever. And that basically they're just going to ignore any marijuana possession under a certain threshold. Um, that's what it is right now, and the Texas state governor, especially, but also a good chunk of the Republican Party in the House and Senate in Texas right now are opposed to the sort of illicit pseudo THC market right now that we have right now, and are they want to restrict it. They want to take it away completely. And this is a point where they're a bit hypocritical, right? They talk about being small government, but when it comes to the definition of small government, these local cities saying, hey, we don't want to spend resources. Austin's like, hey, we don't care about weed. We don't want to spend resources dealing with it. That they're like, no, no, you're not allowed to do that. I love the idea that you have these small government conservatives, but they're not really small government. They're small government to the state. The state is the perfect size. I love the idea of this small government person. Like for them, the state is the perfect size, and that any smaller is too small, but any bigger is too big. And but they call themselves small government conservatives, just like out of convenience, out of strategically. I love the idea though of them just being like, the state is perfect, the perfect size. Smaller, more local? No, 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 we don't want that. We don't want that. We don't want that. But the state's perfect size. But local government, that's the most important way to do this, guys. Those guys in Washington don't have our best interest at heart, you know? While several courts have previously upheld local cannabis decriminalization laws, an appellate court comprised of three conservative justices appointed by Governor Greg Abbott has recently pushed back against two of those rulings, siding with the state in its legal challenge to the marijuana policy in Austin and San Marcos. San Marcos is the city that has Texas State University. That's what it's like 90% of that city is Texas State University. San Marcos is like, I'm pretty sure, like an hour south of Austin. It's like an hour drive from Austin or so. Despite the ongoing litigation and advancement of the House and Senate bills, Texas activists have their targets set on yet another city, Kyle, where they hope Ooh, that is a huge typo. Where they hope to put an initiative before voters to enact local marijuana reform at the ballot this coming November. Abbott has lashed out against the municipal cannabis reform efforts. Quote, local communities such as towns, cities, and counties, they don't have the authority to override state law, the governor said last May. Quote, if they want to see a different law passed, they need to work with their legislators. Let's legislate to make let's legislate to work to make sure that the state as a state will pass some of the law. I think this is really cynical and bad faith, though, that he's saying this, because I think even if they did it through all the proper channels, like the House and the Senate both passed their own versions of the bill to get it through to the governor, I'm pretty sure the Texas governor has veto power and that he would veto it. So he's saying do it through the proper channels and it's fine. But no, but if they did it through the proper channels, you would squash it, right? I'm going to double check right now that Texas governor has veto power because I know there are like there's a big difference between the power that governors are allotted in states. There are like there are soft power governors and there are hard power governors depending on the state and the rules and whatnot. So let's see. Okay, so not only does the governor have veto power, they have line item veto power, which is like maximally strong. So yeah, this is in total bad faith. There's absolutely no way that Greg Abbott would sign a legal medical marijuana or recreational marijuana bill in Texas into law if it passed through the House and Senate through proper channels or whatever the fuck he's insinuating. He would not support it. He would veto it and block it with all his might. He said it would lead to chaos and create an unworkable system for voters in individual cities to be picking and choosing the laws they want to abide by under state statute. Abbott has previously said that he doesn't believe people should be in jail over marijuana possession, although he mistakenly suggested at the time that Texas had already enacted a decriminalization policy to that end. Oh my God, did our governor literally think that we had marijuana decriminalized when we didn't? Bro. In 2023, Ground Game released a report that looked at the impacts of marijuana reform laws. It found that the measures will keep hundreds of people out of jail, even as they have led to blowback from law enforcement in some cities. The initiatives have also driven voter turnout by being on the ballot, the reporter said. Another cannabis decriminalization measure that went before voters in San Antonio that year was overwhelmingly defeated, but that proposal also included unrelated provisions to prevent enforcement of abortion restrictions. Very weird that they created a ballot proposal for marijuana, but they tied in some abortion enforcement nonsense into it. I can't think of a faster way to kill marijuana bill that ostensibly would pass in Texas by slapping on some weird anti-abortion nonsense onto it. That's how you're gonna. It seems like such a weird choice. I wonder if that was done on purpose. I wonder if like maybe the people that are against the marijuana bill somehow got this strapped to it, knowing that it would kill the bill. Wouldn't surprise me if that turned out to be the case. Meanwhile, in March, the Texas Senate approved a bill that cannabis advocates and stakeholders said would effectively eradicate the state's hemp industry, prohibiting consumable products derived from the plant that contain any amount of THC. That, as well as another measure from Representative Joe Moody to decriminalize cannabis statewide, is one of the latest of nearly 24 cannabis related proposals filed so far in Texas for the current legislative session. Various other measures would legalize adult use cannabis, remove criminal penalties for cannabis possession, and adjust the state's existing medical marijuana laws, among others. Moody sponsored a similar marijuana decriminalization bill last legislative session in 2023. That measure, HB 218, passed the House on an 87 to 59 vote, but later died in a Senate committee. The House had already passed earlier cannabis decriminalization proposals during the two previous legislative sessions in 2021 and 2019, but the efforts have consistently stalled in the Senate amid opposition from the lieutenant governor. Separately, the Texas House last week passed a pair of bills designated to ensure speedy access to psychedelic-assisted therapy in the event of federal approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Interesting. So I didn't know about that. So I guess they passed some preemptive bill saying if the USDA approves certain psychedelic assisted therapies, that they will automatically be legalized in Texas. I guess it's sort of like those anti-abortion bill those anti-abortion trigger bills they had in place in a number of states following the removal of the Roe v. Wade ruling. There were a number of states that had passed in the weeks prior to the expected Roe v. Wade overturning. They had passed bills saying basically as soon as the government, like if they were to overturn Roe v. Wade, if the Supreme Court makes a decision in this sort of way, that this bill will automatically kick in and will automatically enforce an abortion ban like immediately as soon as the Supreme Court releases a decision like that. I wonder if this works in a very similar manner. So we're going to read one more article about this from the Texas Tribune talking about this same medical marijuana program. The Texas House advanced a bill Tuesday that would expand the conditions eligible for the state's medical marijuana program, including chronic pain and Crohn's disease, and allow for prescribed smokable products to be sold by prescription. House Bill 46 by Representative Ken King, a Canadian. What? Are Canadian? I don't know what that means. Is the guy's last name Canadian? I'm so confused. House Bill 46 by Representative Ken King, our Canadian, would allow patients in the state's medical marijuana program to use products like cannabis patches, lotions, prescribed inhalers, and vaping devices. The House approved the bill 122 to 21 on Tuesday, advancing it to the Senate. If it becomes law, the list of qualifying conditions would also expand to include chronic pain, traumatic brain injury, Crohn's disease, and digestive and degenerative disc disease. The bill would also let licensed dispensers open more satellite locations, which supporters say is necessary to prevent the industry from crumbling. There are too many Texans who are still struggling to get access to the medicine they legally have a right to receive, King said on Monday from the floor, pointing out his bill would allow for additional dispensing locations outside of Central Texas, where all dispensaries are currently located. Representative Penny Morales Shaw, Democrat from Houston, said rural Texans would have more access. Too many of our fellow Quote, too many of our fellow Texans are forced to either suffer or self-medicate because they don't have sufficient access, and this is an amazing alternative to addictive, harmful opioids, which we know is a huge problem, she said on Monday. In Texas, licensed medical cannabis providers must house all operations, including cannabis cultivation, processing, extracting, manufacturing, testing, and dispensing under one roof. Oh my God, I had no idea that is hilariously restrictive, and it completely explains why there's like basically zero dispensaries. On top of the like THC, the insane THC percentage restrictions that they have, like even for products that are in these legal dispensaries, I think they're only allowed to have up to like a couple percentage or something of THC in them. The idea that they have to do literally everything under the same roof, cultivate, process, extract, manufacture, test, and dispense is crazy. It's so that is clearly a bill. Whenever they wrote that bill, to me, the way that is written shows me 100% that it was infected by people that didn't want it to pass. That they somehow got it to pass, but that the people that didn't want it to pass managed to water it down and infect it with bad stuff enough and bad policy enough that it just is effectively doesn't exist. State regulations also prohibit inventory storage of medical cannabis products in multiple locations, so products must be distributed from the central dispensary. Any prescriptions scheduled for pickup outside the central dispensary must be driven daily to and from the pickup location, sometimes thousands of miles round trip. This method puts wear and tear on our vehicles, limits the amount of time we can spend with patients, and can compromise product integrity, said Terrence Bowe, marketing manager for Good Blend, Austin-based medical marijuana producer. We might drive 200 miles, and the person we are delivering to might not even be there at the moment. Yeah, I'm just thinking of like Uber Eats or whatever. Think of all the times like Uber Eats drivers go to drop off something and the person actually isn't there waiting for them. Imagine that, but you had to drive 200 miles to deliver this weed, and they weren't, and they just like ghost you. This has made their products more expensive and limited where the medical marijuana program can reach, hampering the smell, hampering the small medical cannabis market in Texas. We also don't have enough doctors in the program and not enough people prescribing for it, and most patients find us through a doctor. We are dealing with several different challenges, but we are hopeful these bills might help, said Bo. House Bill 46 is meant to correct some of this problem by allowing medical marijuana distributors to store their products in various satellite locations instead of having to drive across the state to return the product every day. However, the most significant potential challenge would be allowing smokable marijuana products, such as vapes, to be introduced into the program, helping to match the popularity of products found in the hemp industry. The Texas medical program can currently only sell gummies, lozenges, topicals, beverages, and tinctures, as smoking or vaping products have not been approved. Many hemp products, which are unregulated and sold more freely in smoke shops, also give the same high as medical marijuana, but are cheaper for consumers and don't require a visit to a medical professional for pre-approval to purchase. This ease of access has pretty much made the medical marijuana program irrelevant, according to the medical marijuana industry. That completely makes sense. Yes, there's basically nothing that distinguishes the kind of product that you would get in one of these legal dispensaries and the stuff that you would just get at the smoke shop down the street. And if there's basically no difference, if the THC cap at the legal dispensary is like 2%, which is basically non-existent, and this in the cap at the smoke shop is 0.2%, which is effectively the same, might as well be the same percentage, then there's basically no reason for people to go to these dispensaries and buy what I would assume is very overpriced, very low grade weed when they can just go buy the like synthetic pseudo weed, Delta 8, Delta 9, THCA stuff at the smoke shop down the street. That completely makes sense to me and lines up with my personal experience. Dylan Dabblegott, a senior manager of cultivation at Good Blend, said the only difference between hemp and medical marijuana is that hemp is harvested earlier. Hemp is just a little more flexible, while marijuana is produced for high THC alone, he said. By allowing smokables and expanding the conditions, the medical marijuana producers are hoping this will open the market up to more patients and increase the demand for products. Texas lawmakers are also determining the future of hemp this session, as a House panel approved last month a bill also authored by King to tighten regulations on Texas's consumable hemp industry, setting up a potential clash with Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and the Senate, who are pursuing a total ban on THC products. I think we can coexist with hemp. We just want an even playing field, said Bo. I believe additional regulations are needed on hemp, and we need to loosen some on medical marijuana. King noted on Monday that HB 46 would have no effect on hemp and that the future of the industry will be decided another day. The other bill will be coming to a House floor near you, he told lawmakers. Interesting. So I'm fascinated to see where all of this will land, um, because it seems like there's two conflicting bills in the Texas legislature right now. One trying to outright ban all like currently legal pseudo marijuana products. Basically ban any hemp derivative product at all, which would completely kill the pseudo THC market that we have right now. Any Delta 8, Delta 9, THCA, all that stuff would be illegal overnight. On one hand, you have a bill trying to do that, and on the other hand, you have a bill trying to expand the medical marijuana program, the bare bones. It's I wouldn't even say bare bones; it's less than bare bones. But the bare bones medical marijuana program we have in Texas right now, there's another bill trying to expand that. So I'm fascinated to see how this will turn out because it seems I feel like there has to be a number of people in the legislature that have supported both bills based on the number of votes because both bills seem to have passed pretty like by decent margins, which makes me think that there may be some that voted for both, which I would love to hear the reasoning from a legislature that voted for both the restriction of the the pseudo THC hemp industry we have, but also expand the legal marijuana industry. It seems like a strange position to hold, but I don't know. So I'm fascinated to see how all this turns out, and hopefully it results in more and better access to THC products for Texans. If you live in the DFW area, you are by distance farther from a legal dispensary than like almost anywhere in the country because so much of the country has legalized at this point that most places that you could find yourself in the country, you are like not that far. Maybe you can cross the next state over, you cross the border of the next state over and you can go or something. But for Texas, there's no close access to recreational THC marijuana at all. Oklahoma to the north has a medical program, but it's pretty restrictive and you can't access it if you're a Texas resident. I don't think Louisiana to the east has anything. And to the west, we have New Mexico, which I believe does have a program, but the drive from DFW or Austin or Houston or anywhere anybody actually lives in Texas to New Mexico, where a dispensary might be, is really, really long. It's like a 12-hour drive or something insane like that. So if you live in Texas, if you live in the DFW area, you are in one of the driest areas as far as legal high grade marijuana products go. Alrighty. Well, That's all she wrote. I'm Michael Winkler. This has been the Mike Wink Show. Peace out, y'all.